So let me start by telling you part of a story. This morning, we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about covering up. And we're going to talk about coming out of hiding. And so I'm going to share with you the pathway to freedom. How do we get to freedom? But first, let me talk about how guilt works on you. Let me talk about how guilt works on me. Let me tell you about a man who took the life of an older man that he lived with. Not for any reason, just fear and sheer madness. So he killed him. He was mad, he was afraid, just the look of him terrified him. So he killed him, and he did it well. There were no traces. He was smart. He disposed of the body. The police came to investigate because the man went missing, and the singular madness that sets in when we know that we've done something wrong takes over. Let me read you a snippet of this story from the original words of its author, Edgar Allan Poe. He says, "The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerfully, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale, and I wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still, they sat and chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. What could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when it's enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to a fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? What could I do? That's the question that I hope today's psalm will answer. So listen, this is a fictional story called The Telltale Heart that I first heard before a haunted hayride as a middle schooler. But it isn't just a scary ghost story. In fact, it isn't successful because it's a scary ghost story. It's been successful because at once you read it and you understand it. He's telling a story about a murderous madman, true, but the truly scary bit is that I see myself in the murderous madman. Haven't you been there? Like talking more and more to try to cover it up, to try to dig yourself out of whatever situation you're in, to try to make sure that nobody has the slightest suspicion of the things that you're hiding? Haven't you been there, your heart aching, worrying that people know the things that are deep inside you, that people have noticed? Haven't you just wanted people to be gone so that you could be with yourself in the things that you've messed up on? Your voice raises, your heart races, always wondering if people know what you're ashamed of, or worried that they may find out. I relate to this story. I have felt this guilt. I suspect you have too. And so has David, the author of the psalm. And so I wanted to start here. I wanted to start with the guilt. I wanted you to understand what David understood, because it's the backdrop of this psalm. This isn't a psalm about feeling guilty. And so the sermon that I'm about to preach isn't a sermon preached to make you feel guilty. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I just suspect that you already do or already have. So let me read this morning's psalm. This is Psalm 32, and it'll be up on the screen too. Psalm 32. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away. Through my groanings all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped, as in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you, while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by a bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. Many are the woes of the wicked, but the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad, you righteous. Sing, all you who are upright in heart. Amen. So hear this. I'm not trying to get you to feel guilty. I am asking you, do you feel guilty? Are there things in you that you're ashamed of, that you're covering up, that you're hiding? Do you want to feel better? If I can get verses 4 and 5 up there, Katie, this is what the psalmist says. Actually, I think I want verses 3 and 4. Yeah, there we go. So when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For night and day, your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. That's David's version of the Telltale Heart. That's David's version of, that's graphic. While I kept silent, my bones wasted away. People couldn't see that I was dead inside. That's what that says. People couldn't see that I was deteriorating on the inside. While I kept silent, my bones wasted away, and I felt like I was suffocating because I felt like your hand was heavy upon me. I'm asking you if you've ever felt that. Have you ever felt as though your silence was eating away at you from the inside, that you were wasting away, that your strength was sapped, and that someone was literally holding you down, that God was literally holding you down? If you felt that way, if you do feel that way, and because you may someday feel that way, I want you to know that this psalm that we're talking about this morning is not a song sung written from the midst of guilt. This is a celebratory song. This is what happens after he's felt guilty. This is a way through. It is a song of a man who's been freed from the burden of guilt. And so it isn't about why you should feel guilty or ashamed. It's about someone who has felt that way and doesn't any longer. Look at what he says. Look at what the psalmist says in verses 1 and 2. He says, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, in whose spirit is no deceit." Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered, whose sin is not counted against him. This is a psalm of relief. So 3 different ways here. He's relieved of his guilt 3 different ways. He says his sins are forgiven. He says that they're covered, and he says that they're not counted against him. This is total and complete absolution. Because sin works on us in a lot of different ways. If I lie to you, then you have cause to be angry at me. I have cause to be ashamed, and you have cause to never believe me again, right? All those levels are true. If I lie to you, then you should be angry at me, I should feel ashamed, and you should not trust me. Those are all the ways that sin breaks relationships. And so it is all well and good if you forgive me in the sense that you decide not to be angry at me anymore. But it's still a problem if I'm suffocating under the shame that I felt. And the humiliation of everybody seeing that I lied. And it's still a problem if I'm reminded every time I said something, well, you need to take that with a grain of salt. Like, he can't be trusted. And so, there are healthy ways to set up boundaries to give ourselves room to heal. So, I'm not saying that you shouldn't take things with a grain of salt when people have lied to you before, but this just isn't about that. This is a sermon about how you should operate. This isn't a sermon about how you should operate in a broken world where people have sinned against you and you have to forgive people. This is a sermon about when you're the sinner. This isn't a sermon about when you're sinned against. This is a sermon about when you're the sinner. David was the sinner. And I don't know what sin he was talking about in this particular sermon. He had enough to deal with. He had enough to pick from, but he was a sermon. But he was a sinner. Yeah. David's a remarkable case because he was a mess, and he was still cherished by Israel. He's an example of the grace of God because he was a sinner. And this describes his encounter with the mercy of God. When he encounters the mercy of God, when his sin encounters the mercy of God, he experiences forgiveness. His relationship is restored. He experiences covering. Since the first sin, our instinct has always been to cover our shortcomings. That was Adam and Eve's first instinct when sin entered the world. They had sin, and their instinct was to cover it up. And so they found the biggest leaves that they could and tied them around themselves and called that good. And then when God uncovered their sin, when God said, "Where are you? Why are you hiding?" When he uncovered their sin, they confessed to him, and he covered them up with the skin of animals. Because when you're willing to be uncovered before God, he will cover you. The psalmist no longer feels exposed. He's able to talk about his sin freely because he isn't exposed anymore. He isn't vulnerable anymore. And so it is. He is no longer shamed before his God. He is covered. And he is redeemed from the consequences. His sin is not counted against him. God does not count his sin against him. This doesn't need to further taint his every interaction with the Father. And so, this is where the psalmist gives his history. He talks about how he is feeling blessed, how he is feeling freed from the sin that he dealt with. And then he moves into this place where he talks about his history, where he talks about how his bones were wasting away, where he felt like God's hand was upon him and his strength was sapped, like in the heat of day. He talks about what he was freed from. And so this psalm kind of moves in four movements. First, he talks about how good it is to be freed. What it is like. And then he talks about what it felt like before to be trapped under the weight of sin, his bones wasting away a bit. And now this third movement, he talks about how he went from feeling like his bones were wasting away to feeling blessed, forgiven, freed, covered, freed from shame. And so how do you go from suffocating under the weight of a guilty conscience to feeling like God is pressing his hand down on your back, to feeling freed and blessed and without shame? Can I get verses 5 through 7 here? I've already got it. She's way on the ball. And then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. The title of this whole series is No More Hiding. No more hiding. No more having to hide. Because the Psalms invite us to come out of hiding, to be honest with God, and to be honest with ourselves. When we feel exposed or vulnerable or threatened, our instinct is to cover up. We protect ourselves, we shield ourselves, we hide our soft spots. That's how we get through life. We protect ourselves, we cover ourselves. We protect all of our weak points or our vulnerable points. And so we're doing this series. What we're doing is we're exploring the vulnerable, exposed points of the psalmists' lives, because they're exposed, not primarily to us. The Psalms aren't primarily written to us. They're exposing themselves to God. This is prayer. They're exposing themselves to God, and they allow us to see into it. And so we're exploring their vulnerable points. And so Pastor Tim talked about doubt last week, because doubt is a place where we feel threatened. Doubt is a place where we feel vulnerable. Prayer is a safe place. It's at least a good place to expose that. And so we're going to talk about anger, and we're going to talk about sadness. We're going to talk about joy, because all of those are places where we are vulnerable. We're even vulnerable in our joy. This is our guilt. This is our shame. David was keeping it hidden at all costs, and it was costing him, because shame does cost us. Guilt does cost us. It eats away at our bones, at everything inside of us. It destroys us. And so the answer was to resist all the impulses, to resist all the natural drives to cover up, and to instead peel back the safety and lay himself bare before God. And so that's what he does. He says, God, I acknowledge my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. He confessed. He made himself vulnerable to God. And God met his confession. He met his confession with warm and tender mercy. He forgave all of the guilt of his sin. The psalmist found peace there. In prayer, the psalmist found peace. He found more than that. He found a safe place. Remember, he said, surely the rising of the mighty water will not reach the faithful who pray to him. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble. Surround me with songs of deliverance. Listen to this, friends. This is the message of Psalm 32. David sinned. He did something wrong, and he felt guilty about it. He felt ashamed of it, and he felt like no one could ever know, because if they knew, it would expose him, and it would undo him. He would lose everything, or at least lose something, if the people knew this thing he did. And so he covered it up, and he found out that cost him something too. It was eating away at him, and he was wasting away and suffocating under the weight of his sin. He was like the murderer in the Telltale Heart, going mad from the guilt, because he took his guilt and his shame and he covered it up. He buried it, and it was taking roots. It was growing into something that poisoned him, that ate away at his foundations. And then he uncovered himself before God. And instead of shame, God met him with love and mercy and acceptance. And then God did for him what he tried to do for himself. But instead of being toxic and poisonous, it became something beautiful and life-giving. God took the thing he was trying to cover up, and God covered it in such a way that it transformed into something incredible. Much the same way as Adam and Eve, when he replaced their fig leaves with animal skins, God covered the psalmist, and the psalmist found in him a hiding place, not to hide from guilt or shame, but to hide from the actual enemy of our souls, because guilt and shame aren't the actual enemies of our souls. They're not what we need protection from. They're what we need freedom from. Our guilt, our shame, it poisons us inside. But there are evils in this world. And where David expected to find a judge, he instead finds his fiercest defender against the evils in this world. So this next movement, the psalmist speaks in a prophetic voice. And so that's not to say that he's predicting the future. It just means that this is what he believes God is saying to him. So these next verses, this is what the psalmist believes God is saying to him. And so the I in this passage is God. And it says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way that you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. Many are the woes of the wicked. But the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad, you righteous. Sing, all you who are upright in heart. Church, I want you to know how liberating of a message this is. This is good. This is really good. Because, why are we afraid of admitting our failings and admitting our vulnerability? Well, for quite a few reasons, right? There are a lot of reasons we're afraid of admitting our guilt. Because we can't control the fallout. Because we like what our life is and we don't want to risk seeing it interrupted. And so, I've read the books, and I've been to church services where the altar was full because the pastor gave a fiery, impassioned message about how you don't want to go to hell and you don't want to see your friends go to hell, and so you need to get right with the Lord. And I'm not that kind of preacher. I'm not going to try to scare you into heaven. And I don't think God is either, because because of this psalm. Because hear this. This is not the voice of guilt. This is the voice of God. That you don't want to go to hell, so you need to confess your sins. That is the voice of guilt, not God. This is really important because I'm going to open up the altar in a few moments, and we're going to have an extended time of prayer. And I want you to know how to respond to the Father. I want you to hear him calling to you. And so hear what he says. Hear clearly God's voice. The voices of guilt and shame are loud. The voice of guilt and shame, they say, you deserve to die. Or maybe nothing so dramatic as that. But maybe just, you deserve to feel this way. The stuff that you're carrying around, you deserve to have it. And it's like all lies. It contains enough truth that it's easy to believe. Sure, you deserve to feel this way, but you don't have to. Sure, you did something wrong and you deserve to bear the consequences of it, but you don't have to. This feeling is just the consequences of your action, the price that you pay. That's what the voices of guilt and shame say. God, your hand is heavy upon me. Sometimes guilt and shame don't say anything. They just gnaw at your insides, making you feel cold and dead and alone and weak, eating away at everything that joy gives you. But guilt and shame are not God. Guilt and shame are the voices that say, even the servants in my Father's house have food to eat. Let me go and beg for my life. Sure, it contains a grain of truth, but it's just not what God's saying. It's just not what he has for you this morning. God's voice is the one that sometimes is quiet behind those other voices, but it's steady and it's firm, and it's saying, come home. It doesn't matter what you deserve. It doesn't matter what you've done. Just come home. You don't have to pay the price for this, and I don't want you to pay the price for this because it's already done. Just welcome home. Come into my house. That's the voice of God. The voice of God is the one that says, come into my house. I will instruct you, and I will teach you in the way that you should go. I'll give you good advice, and I will watch over you with my loving eye. God is saying, don't be like the horse or the mule, because they don't understand, and they have to be controlled by bit and bridle, because the horse and the mule have to get a bit of metal stuck in their mouth. And whenever the animal decides to go its own way, the master sits on its back and yanks on the ropes to turn it to a different course. The master puts enough pressure on it that it forces it to change and turn around. And our King says enough with bits and bridles. He isn't using your sin and your guilt and your shame to steer you in the life that he wants you to live. He's not trying to steer you. There's the most famous line in another short story that is one of my favorites. is about an old woman who is pretty mean and pretty petty. And until her life is threatened by a criminal. And then, all of a sudden, miraculously, she transforms into the sweetest and most godly of people, most understanding of people, kindest of people. And it doesn't save her. The criminal shoots her, and the criminal turns to his friends and says, she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. She would have been a good woman if there had just been somebody there to shoot her every day of her life. If somebody had held a gun to her head, then she would have done all the right things. If God were to treat you like a horse, with a bridle on your head, steering you in the right direction, you wouldn't fail. You wouldn't fall nearly so often. Your life would go easier in some ways, but you wouldn't prefer it, and neither would he. Our Father is not willing to hold a gun to your head every minute of your life, even if that would induce you to make different choices. He has a different tactic. He has a different strategy. He says, come, welcome home. And if you come into my house, then you can sit and eat at my table, and I will teach you all the things that I know, all the things that I know about how the world should be. I will instruct you in the ways that you should go and the choices that you should make. I will advise you and be with you, and my eye will watch over you, and I will be your fiercest defender. You are safe in my house. You're protected in my house. Just come home. The consequences of your sin, I've paid those. I don't bear any grudge against you. I forgive you. And the shame that you feel, I'll cover you up. Just come home. Just uncover yourself before me, and I'll cover you before the rest of the world. And so, how are you feeling this morning? Do you like yourself? Are you proud of the choices that you've made? Or is there a cold, panicked grip inside of you? Is there a ringing in your ears, a weakness? Do you feel as though your bones are wasting away? Or maybe all of that is a little bit too dramatic to strike a tone with you. But do you feel guilty? Do you feel ashamed? This psalm invites you to come out of hiding. It gives you a safe place to uncover yourself and admit to what you've done, and to say that you're sorry for it, and to ask for help in it, in becoming the kind of person that you want to be, in learning the kind of person that God wants you to be. And so that's what confession is. That's all. It's no complicated formula, no ritual. It's just owning your mistakes. It's coming into agreement with God about what you've done and about who you are. It's hearing who he believes you are and believing that with him. It's just owning your mistakes and giving voice to your guilt and your shame, and letting God do what he always does. And so the worship team's going to come and play. And they're going to play for quite a while. And so you're going to have a pretty solid amount of time to pray here. And I don't want you to sit and just wait for it to be over and to hold on to your seats. You've got a pretty solid block of time here, so use it. Use it to pray. And you can do whatever you want, and you can do it however you want. I would encourage you to take your time, and so come and receive communion when you're ready, the body and blood broken and shed for you as a covering for your sin. And I would encourage you to come to this altar and bend your knee and speak to God. And if the altar's full, use the front pew. There is something of value about moving to a different posture and a different position before God. But you can certainly pray in your pew as well. I want to encourage you to come out of hiding. There are a lot of reasons to come forward before him. But confession is one of the reasons that you should come to the altar today. God is inviting you to tell him about it, to expose yourself to him and let him cover you up. Don't come up here to beg for your life. He freely offers your life to you. Just come up here and receive it. Come up here to receive the gift. And so this is the invitation. The worship team is going to play for the next 10 minutes or so, and I will close us. But in the meantime, pray and search yourself. You won't have to search hard. If you find in yourself the cold poison of guilt or shame, come up here and be rid of it. Confess it. Share what you're feeling with your Father and receive his response, which I promise you will be love and mercy and acceptance. And I know that I will not find cause for shame where my Father does not find cause for shame. And so I'll be up here too. And you can talk to me, and you can talk to Pastor Matt, and you can talk to Pastor Tim, and you can make a note on your connection card, and one of us will follow up. If the conversation needs to happen that can't happen this morning, we'll have that conversation some other time. But first and foremost, Jesus has a gift for you. So come and receive it.